In the shadowy corridors of medieval castles, among stone walls that held secrets too dangerous to be spoken aloud, stories were written that rarely appear in official history books. Stories of noble women whose destinies did not belong to them, for from the very day of their birth they were seen as chess pieces on a board ruled by men. Today we travel to the heart of Normandy in 14th century France, to uncover the life of Livia de Mantleur, a young woman born heir to lands, riches, and promises of power, but who was soon trapped in a web of abuse, legal manipulations, and family betrayal. What makes her story remarkable is not only its tragic beginning, but the way she managed to transform it into a legacy of resistance that challenged the entire feudal structure. For Livia did not merely survive the violence of her age, she became a pioneer of women's education and a symbol of defiance against the absolute power of medieval men. What you are about to hear is not a legend or a work of fiction. It is a tale reconstructed from monastic documents, marriage records, and family chronicles preserved in the National Library of France. A testimony that shows us how women in the Middle Ages were not simply silent victims, but also agents of change capable of challenging the most rigid rules of their time. This is not the story of fairy tale princesses or of ladies rescued by knights. It is the story of a teenager who had to face the closest monster, her own guardian, her own uncle, the man entrusted with her protection. And how, against all the logic of her era, she managed to escape, recover her voice, and found an institution that would change the lives of generations of noblewomen. Join me on this journey into the 14th century. Let us discover together how a victim became the architect of her own destiny, and how, out of pain, was born a silent movement that would inspire all of Europe. But before delving into her childhood, let me leave you with a question to reflect on. What would you do if your very own family, the one meant to protect you, became your greatest threat? Livia de Mantleur was born in 1348, the very year the Black Death devastated Europe. It was a time when death hovered over villages and castles alike, and every birth seemed like a miracle of survival. Hers, however, was not only a miracle, it was an event laden with expectations, for Livia entered the world as the sole legitimate heir of the Mantleur family, one of the Norman houses with the greatest economic weight in the region. The castle of Bellefontaine, where she grew up, rose over green hills overlooking 3 entire villages. From its walls one could see the vineyards that produced wines coveted at courtly banquets, and the trade routes linking Normandy with Paris and the northern ports. What Livia was to inherit was not mere property, it was a lineage of power, fertile lands, and strategic routes that ensured influence in the ever-unstable feudal politics. Her father, Baron Guillaume de Mantleur, was a respected man at the court of Philip VI. A seasoned warrior in the early phases of the Hundred Years' War, he had earned recognition for his loyalty to the king, but also for his cunning in managing wealth. From early on he made it clear that Livia would not be raised as an ornamental lady destined only for embroidery and the lute. He wanted his daughter to understand the complexities of feudal administration, for one day she would be the one to secure the continuity of the family name. To that end, he entrusted her education to Dame Marguerite, a Cistercian nun with an impeccable reputation as a tutor of noble daughters. Under her guidance, Livia learned to read and write in Latin, the language of the church and of knowledge. She discovered the foundations of arithmetic, essential for overseeing harvests and taxes. She perfected the arts of embroidery and sacred music, vital for courtly life. But what most surprised those who knew her was her ability to grasp the unwritten rules of feudal power. "She commands Latin better than many clerics," wrote Dame Marguerite in one of her reports to Baron Guillaume. "And she has a sharp mind for administration. If she had been born male, no one would doubt that she is destined to rule." At the age of 8, her precocious intelligence and golden beauty, hair like ripe wheat and green eyes that seemed to hold sunlight, had already sparked rumors. Nobles from Brittany, Anjou, and even England began sending emissaries with marriage proposals. Little Livia was seen as a political bargaining chip, capable of sealing alliances that could decide wars or territorial disputes. But her father, true to his plans, rejected all premature proposals. When you turn 15, he would tell her in private conversations in the castle library, "I will negotiate a marriage that will elevate our lineage. You will not be subordinate, my daughter. You will be a countess or a duchess. Your destiny will be great. During those years, Livia grew surrounded by promises of splendor, unaware that fate, and the plague, would soon unravel the careful plans her father had woven. What was to come would transform her life as a privileged heiress into a tale marked by the darkest betrayal. The winter of 1361 arrived heavy with ominous signs. Peasants whispered of a new wave of bubonic plague spreading through Normandy with terrifying speed. In the villages under Mantler control, church bells tolled incessantly for funerals, and the streets filled with funeral processions. No one was safe, not the peasants who worked the land, nor the merchants who traveled the roads, nor the nobles sheltered behind their stone fortresses. In February 1362, Baron Guillaume de Mantler, Livia's protector and guarantor of her future, fell ill. Chroniclers describe how his symptoms advanced rapidly: high fevers, swollen buboes in the neck, and unbearable pain that consumed him in barely 3 days. The castle court watched helplessly as the man who had fought on battlefields, negotiated with kings, and protected his daughter with paternal zeal succumbed to the same disease that had decimated entire villages. For Livia, who was then only 14 years old, her father's death meant the collapse of everything she had known as stable. The carefully designed project for her future crumbled overnight. According to feudal law, the guardianship of an underage heiress automatically passed to her closest male relative, in this case, her uncle Hugo de Mantler, Guillaume's younger brother. Hugo was a very different man from his late brother. He was 35 years old, had been a widower for 5 years, and had inherited neither Guillaume's military honor nor his nobility of character. While Guillaume had distinguished himself as a warrior in the king's campaigns, Hugo had preferred the quiet life of managing secondary lands, dedicating himself to business with Flemish merchants and the accumulation of wealth. Records describe him as an ambitious, calculating man, always searching for opportunities to expand his power. During the succession ceremony, before the notables of the court, Hugo spoke solemn words. "I will care for Livia as if she were my own daughter. I will honor my brother's wishes and safeguard the future of our house." But the promises spoken in public concealed much darker intentions. From the very first days of his guardianship, Hugo began to show an unsettling interest in the young heiress. His gazes lingered too long. His comments, disguised as compliments, revealed an attention that went far beyond the responsibilities of a guardian. Under the pretext of protecting her, he began to surround her with surveillance, gradually restricting her freedom. The changes came quickly. The keys to the family treasury were transferred exclusively to his custody. The administrators were ordered to report only to him, leaving Livia voiceless in the management of her own lands. Even the letters addressed to Livia were intercepted and read before reaching her hands. When she, with the clarity instilled by her education, asked for reasons, Hugo replied with a mixture of condescension and feigned concern. "It is for your own protection, Livia. You are still too young to understand the complexities of feudal administration. I will take care of everything until the proper time comes." What appeared to be care soon revealed itself as the beginning of a strategy of absolute control. Hugo did not only covet his niece's lands and wealth, he had also set his eyes on her herself, on her body, her inheritance, and her future. What began as administrative restrictions soon became an invisible prison of power, manipulation, and abuse. Thus, within a few months, the young girl who had grown up with the promise of becoming a duchess or a countess found herself under the guardianship of a man who saw her as prey. The plague had not only taken her father away, it had opened the door to the tragedy that would mark the darkest years of her youth. As the months passed, what had begun as administrative control over Livia's properties turned into something far more sinister. Hugo de Mantler did not merely wish to be the administrator of her lands, he sought to become the master of her entire life. The first step in his strategy was to isolate her. He understood that as long as Livia had counselors, protectors, or trusted figures around her, it would be more difficult to subjugate her. And the greatest threat to his plans was Dame Marguerite, the governess who had accompanied Livia since childhood. Marguerite knew all too well the signs of abuse disguised as guardianship. She had noticed Hugo's nightly visits to the young girl's chamber, justified with trivial excuses such as checking whether the windows were shut or ensuring her safety. She had overheard comments about Livia's beauty that belonged not to the language of a guardian, but to that of a man who desired his niece as a woman. With the moral authority granted by her years and her religious status, Marguerite dared to suggest a solution. "My lord," she told Hugo in a private conversation, "it would be prudent to send Livia to a convent to complete her religious education before deciding her marriage. Thus her virtue and reputation are protected, as befits an heiress of her rank." But Hugo immediately rejected the proposal. "No. Livia must learn the practical management of her estates, and I myself will oversee her training. She will remain here, under my direct supervision." From that moment, Marguerite went from being a tolerated ally to becoming an obstacle. Soon after, she was publicly accused of filling the girl's mind with improper ideas, and was expelled from the castle within just 2 days. With her departure, Livia was left without an adult defender, without a counselor, and without a witness to what happened within the intimacy of her home. With the ground cleared, Hugo intensified his control. At first, he presented it as a kind of special education. He told Livia she had to prepare for marriage, that it was necessary for her to understand the obligations of a noble wife so as not to disappoint her future husband. He used the language of pedagogy and feudal duty to disguise what was, in reality, a process of subjugation and abuse. At the same time, he began to devise a legal plan to ensure that, beyond appearances, no one could strip him of control over her. To this end, he consulted jurists from Normandy, exploring the gaps in canon and feudal law. He discovered that if a noblewoman lost her virginity outside marriage, her value as a wife decreased drastically. Some could even be deprived of their inheritance under accusations of moral indignity. Armed with this knowledge, Hugo realized he could turn his abuse into a binding contract. And so he did. He forced Livia to sign documents in legal Latin, unintelligible to her, that bound her as his official concubine. The contract stipulated that if she attempted to abandon that position, she would lose her hereditary rights and could be accused of treason against her family. To reinforce the illusion of legality, Hugo forged evidence, love letters supposedly written by Livia to young men of the castle, bribed witnesses who swore they had seen her in improper situations, and even a falsified medical report confirming the loss of her virginity. Thus, what was essentially kidnapping and systematic rape was transformed, in official records, into a consensual arrangement. In the eyes of feudal law, Livia was not a victim, she was a young woman who had agreed to become her own tutor's concubine. The walls of the castle, which had once been her home, became a gilded prison. Livia's chambers were moved next to Hugo's, connected by a private door that only he had the right to open. The windows were reinforced with decorative bars. The servants were under strict orders to obey Livia only to the extent that Hugo permitted. The isolation was total. And the message was clear, there was no escape. In just 1 year, the promising heiress, educated to be a countess or duchess, became the private property of her tutor, trapped in a legal, social, and psychological web from which escape seemed impossible. But what Hugo did not foresee was that, in the midst of this captivity, Livia would begin to sow the seed of her resistance, a seed that, over time, would grow strong enough to tear down the invisible walls he had built around her. In the autumn of 1363, Livia discovered she was pregnant. She was barely 15 years old. The news filled her with conflicting emotions, fear for her situation, anxiety about what was to come, but also a glimmer of hope in the darkness. The child growing in her womb was, in a way, the only thing that belonged entirely to her, the only thing Hugo could not claim as his own without it remaining a part of her. When she informed her tutor of the pregnancy, Hugo's reaction was cold and calculated. To him, the pregnancy was not the result of love or family life, it was a strategic move. "A child of ours will consolidate our union and ensure my control over your lands," he said with barely concealed satisfaction. But his enthusiasm vanished in March 1364, when Livia gave birth to a daughter. The little girl was named Marguerite, after the governess who had been expelled from the castle. Hugo, disappointed, made his feelings clear immediately. A daughter does not give us the advantages we need. We will have to continue trying until we produce a male heir. For Livia, however, Marguerite became a symbol of quiet resistance. The child was a reminder that, despite her captivity, she still had the power to give life, to convey love, to create a different future. And in an environment of total subjugation, that was an act of rebellion. However, the joy of motherhood was quickly taken from her by Hugo. He considered caring for the child to interfere with Livia's duties as a concubine, so he decided to place Marguerite with a wet nurse in a separate section of the castle. Livia was allowed to see her only once a week, for an hour, and always under supervision. Those visits became doses of hope and torment at the same time. Livia would stroke her daughter's small hands, cradle her, sing to her in Latin the hymns she had learned as a child. Each farewell, however, was heart-wrenching. And Hugo knew it. He used Marguerite as a psychological tool, issuing cruel threats. If your behavior is not satisfactory, I may decide that these visits are a privilege, not a right. In the following years, Livia suffered 2 more pregnancies, both ending in miscarriages. Chroniclers suspect that the constant stress, isolation, and physical and emotional pressure caused these losses. Hugo interpreted the miscarriages as Livia's personal failure. A concubine who cannot give me male heirs has little value, he reproached her harshly. But what he saw as weakness transformed within Livia into quiet determination. Every tear shed in solitude, every limited visit with her daughter, every humiliation disguised as a lesson in marriage strengthened her conviction that she had to find a way out. In public, Hugo saw a submissive, obedient young woman resigned to her fate. But in private, Livia began to rebuild something he would never suspect, her inner strength. She kept memories of Dame Marguerite's teachings, mentally reviewed the principles of feudal administration she had learned from her father, and above all, repeated to herself that one day, somehow, she would regain her freedom. During those years of watched motherhood and constant repression, Livia had no weapons or allies. But she had regained something essential, a reason to resist. Her daughter Marguerite became the beacon that would drive her to prepare what, over time, would become one of the most daring escapes in the history of Normandy. In February 1366, when Livia had already spent more than 3 years living under Hugo's control, fate placed a man in her path who would change the course of her life, Frère Thomas, a 45-year-old Benedictine monk. His arrival at Bellefontaine Castle seemed routine. He had been sent as part of a mission to catalogue religious manuscripts in noble libraries across Normandy. Benedictine monks were known for their intellectual discipline and discretion, which meant their presence rarely aroused suspicion. To Hugo, Frère was just another clergyman, interested in scrolls and psalters. But what Hugo did not know was that this monk had a special sensitivity for detecting hidden abuses. For years, Frère had served as a confessor in monasteries and aristocratic courts, learning to read invisible signs, evasive glances, prolonged silences, gestures of fear. It did not take long for him to notice something strange in the relationship between Livia and her tutor. He observed how Hugo always stayed close to her, how he interrupted any attempt at private conversation, and how his gaze toward the young woman was not that of a protector, but of a man asserting possession. Confirmation came during a private confession that Livia requested in March of that year. For the first time in a long while, she had the opportunity to speak without fear of being overheard by Hugo. Frère, in a calm voice, asked her a simple but devastating question. "Tell me, my daughter, did this agreement with your guardian begin by your own choice, or were there circumstances that limited your freedom?" That gesture of humanity, that question acknowledging the possibility that she had not consented to her fate, opened a crack in the wall of silence Livia had built over 3 years. Through tears, she confessed everything: the death of her father, Hugo's first nighttime visits, the expulsion of Marguerite the governess, the forged legal documents, and the concubinage contract that kept her captive. Frère listened in horror. Years of pastoral experience allowed him to distinguish between confused stories and truths impossible to fabricate. What Livia described was not accepted concubinage, it was kidnapping, systematic abuse, and legal fraud. "What your guardian has done to you is not only a sin before God, my daughter," he said firmly, "it is a crime against feudal law and the church. He has no rights over you or your lands. And most importantly, you are not alone. If you wish, I will help you escape." For the first time since her father's death, Livia felt something she had forgotten: hope. Over the following weeks, she and Fredir began devising a risky and meticulous plan. It involved several steps. Gathering evidence. Fredir used his access to the castle library to obtain secret copies of documents held by Hugo, forged concubinage contracts, correspondence with complicit lawyers, and proof of embezzlement of Livia's properties. Recovering identity and resources. Livia hid small jewels inherited from her mother and family documents that could serve to prove her lineage once she was free. Seeking sanctuary. They contacted Mother Isabel, abbess of the St. Clair convent in Rouen, known for offering refuge to noblewomen fleeing abuse. Her convent was protected by ecclesiastical immunity, meaning that even a powerful noble like Hugo could not enter without risking excommunication. Choosing the moment. They discovered that Hugo planned a trip to Paris in May 1366. His absence would be the perfect window to execute the escape. It was a bold plan, full of risks. Fredir did not hide the danger. "If we fail, Hugo could kill you and your daughter. But if we succeed, you will regain your freedom and be able to seek justice." Livia, with an inner strength that had grown in the silence of years of oppression, replied with determination that even surprised the monk. "I would rather die free with my daughter than live another day as a slave in this prison." The seed of resistance, which had sprouted with Marguerite's birth, now had an ally. And soon, that seed would become the flame of an escape that would test all their courage. On May 15, 1366, Hugo departed for Paris with an escort of 12 men, confident that his castle and niece were under complete control. He could not imagine that his absence would open the opportunity Livia and Fredir had been secretly preparing for months. 2 days later, in the early hours of May 17, Livia began her flight. Dressed in simple clothing to avoid attention, she carried a small backpack with essentials, a few inherited jewels, family documents, and copies of the forged contracts Fredir had obtained. Most importantly, however, she carried her daughter Marguerite, then barely 2 years old. The nurse's complicity proved crucial. Under the pretext of an early walk, she brought the child to the meeting point at the stables, where Fredir waited with 3 ready horses. A bribed guard discreetly opened the doors for them. The plan seemed perfect. But barely 2 miles had passed when they were confronted by a group of 8 riders. At the front rode Roland, Hugo's loyal captain. Evidently, the guardian had anticipated the possibility of flight and had left clear instructions: monitor Livia closely. "Give me Livia de Mantler," Roland shouted. "You are under arrest for property theft and for violating your lord's contract." What followed was a desperate chase through the Norman forests. Livia, carrying Marguerite, was forced to abandon her horse when the terrain became too rough. Fredir, realizing capture was inevitable, made a heroic decision. He stopped to confront the pursuers. "Run, my daughter," he shouted to Livia. "Take your child to the convent. I will hold them off." The monk resisted as long as he could but was mercilessly struck down. His sacrifice, however, bought enough time for Livia to cross into ecclesiastical jurisdiction and reach the St. Clair convent. Exhausted, on the verge of collapse, she handed Marguerite to Mother Isabel and presented the evidence she had managed to rescue. There began a new battle, the legal one. For 6 months, from May to November 1366, Mother Isabel and a group of sympathetic lawyers worked tirelessly to build a case against Hugo. The task was titanic. In medieval France, the law rarely favored women, especially when facing influential nobles. But the evidence collected by Fredir was compelling. Concubinage contracts drafted under coercion. Correspondence proving legal fraud and embezzlement of property. Testimonies from servants and nurses confirming Livia's isolation. To this was added an unexpected fact: other noblewomen were encouraged to testify. Until then, they had remained silent out of fear and shame, but Livia's courage inspired them. Dame Catherine de Bretagne, Dame Rosalie de Poitiers, and Dame Blanche de Champagne recounted similar abuses committed by Hugo: contract manipulation, blackmail, and sexual coercion. The ecclesiastical court could not ignore the magnitude of the case. In December 1366, it issued a historic verdict. The concubinage contract was declared null and fraudulent. Livia regained full control of her lands and custody of her daughter. Hugo was excommunicated, and his assets were confiscated to compensate the victims. However, as was often the case in medieval justice, the punishment was not complete. Hugo managed to flee to England before being arrested, living in exile until his death in 1373. Even so, for Livia, the verdict represented an unprecedented victory. She had not only regained her freedom and her properties but had also succeeded in having a church tribunal officially recognize her as a victim of abuse and fraud. And most importantly, her case had given a voice to other women who had remained silent until then. For the first time in a long time, Livia was not simply a survivor. She was a free woman, with a future of her own to decide. At just 18 years old, Livia de Mantler had survived the plague, the abuse of her guardian, a forced concubinage, the loss of unborn children, and an escape that cost the life of her greatest ally. Now, for the first time, she had in her hands something she had believed lost forever: freedom. The court returned custody of her daughter and control of her lands to her. Suddenly, she found herself in an unusual position. She was one of the few noblewomen in Normandy managing her estate directly, without relying on a husband. And that freedom was no coincidence, it was the result of years of suffering transformed into determination. Marriage proposals soon began to arrive. Counts, dukes, and even emissaries from rival houses offered themselves to restore the social prestige that the scandal with Hugo seemed to have tarnished. But Livia surprised everyone by rejecting them one by one. "I would rather govern my lands alone than be someone else's property again," she wrote in her journal. Marriage can become another form of prison if it is not founded on mutual respect. Her decision was revolutionary. In a society where the lives of noblewomen were almost always tied to their husband's surname, Livia chose independence. And with that choice, she opened an unexplored path for others. During the second half of the 1360s, Livia established herself as an exemplary administrator. Her vineyards achieved record harvests. The villages under her rule prospered thanks to fair trade policies and reinvestment in infrastructure. The trade routes she inherited generated income comparable to that of the most powerful ducal houses in France. But what truly made her a symbol was her decision to found an institution unique for its time. In 1370, she inaugurated the St. Marguerite Academy, named in honor of her former governess, the woman who had tried to protect her and instilled in her the value of knowledge. The academy was neither a convent nor an entertainment hall, it was a school for daughters of nobles, with a radically innovative curriculum. In addition to embroidery, music, and courtly etiquette, students learned advanced Latin, to read legal and religious documents without relying on clerics. Commercial mathematics, to manage estates and trade routes. Principles of feudal law, to understand their inheritance rights. Administrative techniques, to govern villages and castles. And most controversially, education to identify and resist psychological manipulation and abuse of power. "No woman should face alone what I endured," Livia wrote in a letter to Mother Isabel. "Knowledge is the best defense against men who seek to take advantage of our vulnerability." The impact was immediate. At first, many noble parents were reluctant to send their daughters, fearing that an overly advanced education would make them problematic. But they soon discovered that these young women, trained at the academy, were capable of managing estates, negotiating alliances, and protecting family wealth during times of war. The academy's reputation crossed borders. Students arrived from Flanders, the German states, and other regions of France. Some replicated the model on their own lands, creating a network of educated noblewomen aware of their rights and willing to support each other. Marguerite, Livia's daughter, grew up in this environment. She became one of the most educated women in Normandy and, years later, chose her husband by her own will, Henry de Bexon, a man who respected her independence and signed an unprecedented marriage contract guaranteeing that Marguerite would retain control of her properties. By 1380, the network of women trained at St. Marguerite Academy had spread throughout Western Europe. In letters preserved in archives, Livia's former students described themselves as "sisters of resistance." They were women who had learned to read between the lines of contracts, detect abuses of power, and confront them with the law in hand. When Livia died in 1400, at the age of 52, she was no longer remembered as the victim of an ambitious guardian but as the founder of a silent movement of female education and resistance. Her funeral brought together more than 200 noble and religious women who testified, by their mere presence, to the impact of her life. Livia's legacy was clear: to turn pain into knowledge, and knowledge into shared power. The story of Livia de Mantler is not only the tragedy of a young noblewoman trapped by the laws and abuses of her time. It is also the chronicle of a rebirth, how a victim became a leader, and how an isolated woman built a legacy that transformed generations. Her life reminds us that even in the darkest periods of history, knowledge and solidarity can become more powerful weapons than any sword. And now I ask you, what other hidden stories of brave women do you think we should rescue from the past?